More Christ is sponsored by Sheer Blooms. Sheer Blooms is a flower preservation specialist. If you live in Britain or Ireland and wish to have your flowers preserved for special occasions, then please follow the details on your screen. My thanks to my friends over in Patreon. I appreciate your continued support. If you'd like to join us in the More Christ community, you'll receive a number of perks, including early access to new episodes, patron-only videos. You'll be able to ask More Christ guests some of your questions. You'll receive free ebooks online, and you'll also be able to get discount for in-person events. If you join me in the higher tier, then you'll be able to receive further perks, including courses that I'll be offering via my Patreon, including one on storytelling and another on spiritual disciplines in a secular age. Thank you again, and I hope to see some of you join our community.
Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined once again by my friend Dr. Gerard Casey and by Dr. Wanjiru Njoya for the first time. First, Gerard is an Irish philosopher and an author. He's known for his work in political philosophy, ethics, and metaphysics. He's made significant contributions to libertarian political thought and natural law theory. He's the author of several books, including Libertarian Anarchy Against the State and Freedom's Progress, A History of Political Thought. Dr. Wanjiru Njoya then is a scholar in residence for the Mises Institute in the States. Amongst other things, she's the author of Economic Freedom and Social Justice, the classical ideal of equality in context of racial diversity, and Redressing Historical Injustice, Self-Ownership, Property Rights, and Economic Equality. So I suppose just to begin then, and please feel free to add any other biographical information that you wish, but I suppose I wanted to ask what attracted you each to this conversation, and maybe what are some of the main impressions that you have of one another and your bodies of works thus far then, if we start with yourself, Wanjiru?
Attracted me to the
To have been willing to have this conversation with Gerard, and maybe what are some of your impressions from what you've seen of his work and any correspondence you've had online, I suppose.
all right. So I suppose I knew Gerard's work before actually encountering him, and that was more to do with the idea of the interaction between law and anarchy. Because when I wrote about equality, and I was arguing against the idea of equality legislation, and many people are afraid of that because they're afraid that if you have an unregulated society, it's going to be chaos, it's going to be, nobody's going to be safe. And so that's where I started looking into what the idea is of anarchy, and that's when I first came across Gerard's work, his work on anarchy, but also on the history of political thought. I'm a subscriber to his lecture series on the history of political thought, just finding out about how different philosophical perspectives fit in with each other and how they explain the world today. I suppose it's very hard to get caught up on the history of any kind of thought by reading books. You'd need a whole lifetime to read through them. I found it really helpful just listening to summaries.
All right, very good.
So that's where I know about Gerard from.
Thank you, Wanjiru. Yourself, Gerard?
Well, having sedulously avoided Twitter for many, many, many years, regarding it as a sort of tool of the devil, I was I was persuaded by somebody who should be nameless, but he knows who he is, to go on, and I began, sort of reluctantly. My handle has darkened, and people have often asked, why is that? And it's because my first tweet was, I have gone over to the dark side. Anyway, I came across Wanjiru's work on Twitter, and the first time I saw one of her tweets, my jaw dropped so low it bounced off the ground and came back up again. And I said, this is something I've got to follow. And every day I look forward to at least 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 tweets from Wanjiru. She is so refreshingly direct and frank and unabashed in what she has to say that it always makes me feel sort of semi-ashamed of myself that I'm not more direct and have been cowed by so many years of academic terrorism into the situation that I now am. So yeah, so I've come to see her really direct work here, and I haven't actually had the pleasure yet of reading her cooperative work with David Gordon and so on, but I will get around to that eventually. And very much look forward to seeing what she has to say in a less frenetic and polemical environment. I really do look forward to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, folks. And I hope this conversation will serve as a springboard to some of your more academic works, and I'll link those in the description and everything too. And this evening, then, before this conversation, I sent you each a selection of kind of prospective topics that we might go through that I think are of interest to all of us and that have been in the news recently. So if we might go through a few of those today, we'll not get to them all. But the first one was about hate crime legislation and the kind of authoritarianism, nice and light to start us off. So I wondered if we might speak about that, especially in light of what's happened in Scotland and again, what's taking place in Ireland here, unfortunately. And you've both written and spoke about this at length. Can you tell us maybe why it's such a central issue, why this nebulous notion of hate crime and the machinery that goes with that is maybe so concerning, and maybe some hopes that you have in being part of combating this legislation? If we start with yourself for this one, Jared.
Oh Lord, where do I start? So from the time I became a libertarian, I've been a free speech advocate. And so the first book I wrote in the series back in 2019 of 3 books was actually ZAP. It's called Free Speech and Tolerance in the Light of the Zero Aggression Principle. And in this, I resemble David Hume in that book fell stillborn from the press, as far as I can tell. Nobody seems to have noticed that I've been allowed to speak freely about free speech. Nobody seems to be bothered in the slightest by it. And so it's quite extraordinary. And we've seen, by the way, it's not only Ireland and Scotland, it's also now in Poland. And we're seeing in Canada the most extraordinary version, because they've gone one better. They've got a pre-crime element in theirs. And so the justification varies from country to country, but it's really, the idea is that we need to protect certain selected groups, and they're sort of the usual, but they also, as in Ireland, introduce new categories into law which haven't been there before, like gender identity, as if it's something we all know what it is and it's unproblematic. And these people need to be protected because there are horrible people like me and others who will say these devastating things which will cause like psychic anguish, if not actually physical damage to people, if we're not regulated. That's the story. It's nonsense. Okay, through and through. The societies have survived through eons with relative free speech, largely because any functioning society develops norms of decency. So that, as I said, I posted something the other day. I said, the reason we don't go up to somebody in the street who's enormously overweight and say, "My God, you're fat," is not because we fear legal sanctions. It's because we've been properly brought up. You don't normally address yourself like that, unprovoked, in a context where it's not required. If you're a doctor and somebody comes to you, you might say that, perhaps more politely. But no, we don't do that. So what we seem to be now introducing laws to supplement, or in fact to crowd out, social norms, which are actually there already. And we're told that unless, as Wanjiru said earlier, unless we do this, society will collapse. We'll all be going around shouting at each other and hollering and misbehaving generally. That's the sort of ostensible reason. The actual reason, of course, is to preemptively silence us, and to prevent us from asking questions and discussing topics that our political lords and masters would find problematic, okay, and would prefer that we didn't talk about, and induce us, if at all possible, to self-censor. So that there's an expression in Ireland, the Wanjiru may not be aware of this, which says, whatever you say nothing. And that would seem to be the ideal outcome of these kind of laws. So that's where we are. And in Ireland, just to finish for your viewers, because they may not know this, and the legislation has passed all stages in the lower house and is sitting in the upper house, just awaiting their sanction. And partly, I think, as the result of the devastating outcome, as far as the government was concerned, of two recent referenda, which they weren't expecting, they have slightly panicked. And we've seen the most extraordinary political phenomenon of a party whose members voted solidly in favor of this legislation, now saying it's not fit for purpose. Okay. Okay. It's quite extraordinary. I don't know what's going to happen eventually. We're keeping the pressure on. But even if we can squash it here, unfortunately, because of the situation Ireland is in vis-a-vis the EU, we are not independent in the way we should be, and therefore we are likely to come under pressure. Even if this legislation is defeated or dies, we're going to come under pressure again to introduce something along the same lines. And so the fight is likely to be a continuous one.
Would you like to add anything to that one, Giro, from your perspective?
Yeah, just to add to the list of countries that Gerard gave, I would add the United States, because there have been states passing hate speech legislation, and I think there's a lot of complacency because of the First Amendment. And people say, oh, you know, it wouldn't happen in America because of the First Amendment. And so even when state legislatures pass such laws, nobody gets alarmed. They say, oh, it's unconstitutional. You know, we'll just challenge that. We'll send it all the way to the Supreme Court. It'll get struck down. I think there's a lot of complacency around it because I think it overestimates the extent to which you can push back against this tide by fighting constitutional battles. And I think that's a big mistake. I think the principle should be much more strongly defended, even without just saying in this kind of casual way, oh, that's unconstitutional, I wouldn't worry about it. Well, I would worry about it. So just to give an example, we've had a number of people being arrested in the States for reading from the Bible. Because, you know, there'll be a pride march somewhere, and they'll go and start reading from the Bible, you know, from the Old Testament. And then they get arrested. And nobody gets alarmed. They say, oh, it's unconstitutional. You know, the police will have to release him, and the police, you know, you can sue the police for that. You can sue them for false arrest and get damages. Well, yes, you can. But the thing is that it's still a threat to free speech, and I think people ought to take it more seriously.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, folks. And I suppose playing off that then, what are some of the best ways that libertarians can fight against this, say, especially vis-a-vis big tech and this kind of corporatism between big tech and the state? Because I think libertarians are often judged perhaps harshly in, oh, you're too harsh on the government or not harsh enough on the corporations and things like that. But I think that's nonsense. But I wonder if you might speak to that, and to what extent, say, Facebook and those companies are as much of a threat as the state in contemporary culture. Would you speak to that, Jared?
I'm not sure I can really answer that. As I said, having resisted unsuccessfully Twitter, or X as it's now called, I'm not familiar with any other form of social media, so I really have no experience of how they deal with it, or what standards they employ and so on. All of them, of course, come under and are threatened by and regulated by governments of one kind or another. There's the digital, I can't remember what it's called, the Digital Media Act or something like this from the EU, which is quite extensive. And in Ireland here, we have in 2022, there is the Digital Media Act, which gives extraordinary powers to a semi-government body to regulate what goes on in all forms of social media. We haven't seen it, or at least I'm not aware of it, being deployed in any obviously negative way so far, but it may well be that that's going on behind the scenes and I'm just not aware of it. But especially given that Ireland and Dublin in particular houses the headquarters, the European headquarters of many of these bodies, it's actually worrying. It's extremely worrying. But I can't speak from first-hand knowledge on this. It would require somebody who knows much more about the inner workings of social media to actually answer that question satisfactorily.
Thank you, Gerard. And would you like to add anything to that, Wanjiru?
I still think that the primary threat comes from the state and from law, because at the end of the day, you know, if you get booted off Twitter or Facebook, well, that's inconvenient, and I know that people lose a lot from that, especially if that's how you interact with your client base, and you lose all your contacts, and you know, I don't want to underestimate the cost of that, but it's nothing like the threat of being jailed, to my mind.
True.
Being thrown off social media is nowhere near the order of threat as that comes from the criminal law, not just directly in the sense of police knocking on people's doors, which they do. There was that pensioner who had the police knock on her door to ask her why she stopped in the street. This was in Yorkshire. She stopped in the street to take a photograph of a poster
Yes.
of transgender or whatever.
Mm.
And the police came and knocked on her door to ask her why she was doing that, or people getting arrested for praying, or all these kinds of things. It's not just those types of cases where you have a direct interaction with the police, but it's also the way many employers, in order to avoid the police showing up to their employees' door, will just fire them. Or, you know, other people don't want to deal with them. People are afraid of the law, and people are afraid of things that are illegal. And to me, that's the much greater threat.
Indeed, I know, I agree with you. I was really addressing the question of how governments and supranational governments can affect the operation of social media sites rather than that. But you're absolutely correct. And the point that that I and others have made here in the context of the Irish free speech, I beg your pardon, the Irish Hate Speech, Hate Crime Act, is that it creates a chilling effect.
Yes.
So that you're afraid to say anything. First of all, there's a sort of studied ambiguity in the whole notion of hate, whatever that means, is supposed to mean. It's not defined in the Act. And some of the categories, in fact, the category of gender identity is defined in a completely circular fashion in the Act. It's quite amazing. I mean, I'm asking myself, how did somebody like this get to work in the drafting office, legal drafting office? It's quite bizarre. And so nobody knows quite what the story is. And in that situation, it's very hard to blame people for not wanting to attract attention,
Yes.
the attention of the authorities of the police, when there is, from their point of view, as it were, nothing to gain. And even if they are not jailed and are not even sent to trial, nonetheless, the process of investigation is itself a form of punishment.
Yes.
And that's very problematic. I mean, the UK has had much greater experience of this than we have had with the arrest of preachers on the street and that woman that Wanjiru mentioned and so on. And of course, one of the most famous cases of all, which has had some positive effect, that of Harry Miller, the ex-policeman, who was visited because he retweeted an impolite, to put it mildly, a limerick about transgenderism, and was informed, and I've never forgotten this because it is so striking, it imprinted itself on my memory, was informed by the police officer with whom he had conversation that we need to check your thinking.
Yes.
And I thought, wow, you could not have a more obvious statement of what one of the functions of this kind of law is. We need to check your thinking. And in that sense, it's like a kind of newspeak. If you create a situation where people don't want to think about these things and don't want to speak about them, you get the results that you want, which is that you create silence and the possibility of people objecting to laws of various kinds that restrict speech further, protect groups that need to be protected, which an ever-expanding number of groups, almost always, by the way, excluding people like me, A, who are old, B, who are white, and C, who are men. Okay, I'm a triple sinner. I'm really a terrible person. Okay, I'm an old white man. My God, I mean, how can I atone for my wrong being? So yeah, so Wanjiru is exactly right. The legal implications and whether resulting in trial and imprisonment, which may well happen, if not to the population at large, I would think certainly to exemplary cases, so that the others may take note. But many people will get the message, which is to keep their mouth shut, and people prefer security rather than freedom by and large, and they're not going to speak.
Lamentably so. Thank you, folks. And I think another thing that comes out in your work, Wanjiru, and perhaps with you actually, is how, say, the New Left have hijacked language in a way that sells this picture as if it's for our own good. And CSS talks about the kind of reformer will go on interrogating people forever if they think that they're being virtuous, and there's this hijacking of the terms equality and so on. I want to speak to that a little bit, and maybe some of the differences between people who identify as libertarian and conservative. I think in part to do with how do we best take on the New Left, for lack of a better word, who sees the institutions of the West and push through this legislation and so on. And I wonder this in part because conservatives seem to think that we're part, like libertarians are part of the problem. We go on about the free exchange of ideas as if we're naive and so on, that we need to seize the reins of power. We need the ring from the Lord of the Rings. So I wonder if you might speak to that and how we might form allies and so on in a way that's strategically kind of shrewd, but doesn't do away with the kind of moral principles that I think both of you adhere to with libertarianism. So if I might start with you, Wanjiru.
Yeah, that's actually a point that I took from Gerard's work that I thought was really important. And that's this idea that many people think that being a libertarian means having no moral principles or not caring about moral principles, not caring about the family, not caring about society or culture. There's that idea that that's what it means to be a libertarian. And I think that's what many conservatives are against. They feel that that's a way of trying to say to them that all the things that matter to them have no importance. And that's not correct. In fact, I actually have a quote from Gerard's book on this point. I actually extracted the quote because it's saying, I can't remember exactly how you put it, Gerard, but it's saying that being a libertarian does not mean that all these values are meaningless to you. So I think that's a really important point to make, and that there's a lot of common ground then between libertarians and conservatives. Maybe we differ on what we think ought to be done. We may agree on what the problems are, but we may differ on what ought to be done, because libertarians would insist that you must not coerce people into anything. So we would agree on what the important values are, but we would not agree that therefore, having agreed that this is the moral principle, you therefore need to go and coerce people into it. I mean, even religion is a good example of that, because of course, many libertarians are religious, but it doesn't follow that they think that you should force people into religion. So that's, I think, one of the main distinctions, because I know now many conservatives are getting exasperated by the, I don't know whether to call them fake conservatives, who say that they're going to conserve and they don't. and in exasperation against that, they say, you know, we need new laws to force people to do this and that and the other, and that's where they part company with libertarians. But on the whole, I think it's important that we have allies. I'm not a big fan of trying to, you know, to highlight the things that divide libertarians and conservatives, as at least not in the context of the culture wars.
No.
So I think that I think it's important to have allies.
Well, yeah, no, I agree. Yes, I obviously agree with that. If I can name drop for just a moment, I was at a conference some years ago with Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, and he came to my paper, which was very kind, and I came to his. And at my paper, when we had the Q&A session, I said something like the following. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, to dispute the truth of this, but I think my recollection is correct. I said, look, Roger, the situation is like this. When it comes to the substantive issues that you as a conservative care about, family, tradition, morals, manners, all of these things that you think are important, you and I would suggest, with maybe minor differences, are in almost complete agreement. There is no disagreement between us. I value these things as much as you do. The difference is the following, that I am not prepared to use force or have others use force on my behalf to bring these about, no matter how good I might think they are. And that for two reasons. The first reason is it's wrong. It's wrong to do that. And the second, not unimportant, but not as important reason, is that it's often counterproductive. Because what you get when you use force to bring about these things, good as they might be, is that you promote forms of hypocrisy. And what happens then is that when political climates change and power goes out of your hands and into other people's hands, they will react against you and what you value in ways that can be very, very destructive and counterproductive to the very things you want. Things that Russell Kirk, for example, when he writes in his book, he says that libertarians think that liberty is the highest value, and I go, no, it's actually the lowest.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, lowest in the most fundamental, because unless you're free in what you do, unless you can act without coercion, your actions have no moral value. If you're not free, you cannot be held responsible. You're not acting morally. And therefore, in order for, if people want to be religious, to be truly religious, they can only be that if they can be the possibility of being irreligious exists, anti-religious. They can only be in favor of a family if they're not forced to be in families and so on and so forth. So there is no value in the end to producing things by forms of coercion. Moral suasion, by all means. Argument, yes, all of these things can be used and should be used and can be used, but coercion, no. So that's that. It came to this point, and it was very helpful to me to be able to meet with what he had to say, because he's obviously an extraordinarily articulate person and a doughty defender of conservatism. The other thing, by the way, if I could just pass on to it, which is that conservatism as a sort of heuristic, it seems to me to be a very sensible idea. In other words, other things being equal, if things have been done in a certain way, unless you have overwhelming reasons to change how they've been done, you should probably stick with what you've got. The trouble is, as a substantive moral principle or a substantive political principle, it's idiotic. Unless you can guarantee that what you're conserving is independently valuable. In other words, I often argue that in the UK, for example, that the Labour Party makes radical changes and the Conservative Party conserves them.
Yes.
Well, what's the point of that? Okay, the first thing I would have done if I was the Conservative leader and I became Prime Minister would be to repeal the law against fox hunting. Not because it's actually very important, but because it would drive the opposition absolutely crazy, right? And there's a lot more things. The Equality Act would go, the Gender Recognition Act would go. I would have a whole list of acts that would go bang, 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 bang. I would repeal them all. That never happens, right? And it should.
Mm-hmm.
If political conservatism was anything like it was supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, just to give an example of the Equality Act, it's funny the way the Conservative government calls it Labour's Equality Act, it isn't Labour's Equality Act at this point, because the Conservatives had a parliamentary majority when they came in and could easily have got rid of it. In fact, it came into force when the Conservatives were in power. So they could, in fact, simply have said this, we're killing this before it even takes off, and they didn't.
I suppose to not even to play devil's advocate, but to look at the positive in that conservative instinct, if that's the right way to frame it. There seems to be this concern with how the libertarian principle plays out at scale, and I'm wondering what are some good examples societally that we might draw upon as libertarians to say this is a way that we can radically change culture that's not kind of highfalutin or anything. So to give one example from my experience of what I'm interested in, I see what's happening with classical schools in the States and so on, and you have this restoration of the culture in this organic way that has a broad enough appeal. It seems to be across the States, and it's voluntary and so on. You don't have to rely on government coercion. That seems to me to be a good example of what can be done for us as libertarians, rather than just seizing the power of the state and trying to force through these things. Are there others that you think are particularly apropos to this moment, and that you'd say to your conservative friends, well, we can do this. Does that make sense?
If I may, yeah, I would say yes. Excuse me. The bulk of government spending goes on health, education, and welfare. And these are all things that can and should be supplied by people for themselves and for their communities and for people who subscribe to particular organizations. I gave a paper many years ago in Queen's University, Belfast, and it was meant to be polemical, and so I titled it, "Let the Poor Starve." And the reason for that was because the attitude you come across is you libertarians are heartless. You don't care about people. You're perfectly happy to see people die in the street. And so I thought, so that's why I titled it that way. And I went on to show that, of course, long before there was ever any government welfare, people had organized themselves to provide these things for themselves, had organized to provide medical care for themselves and for people who subscribe to various organizations, and indeed even for people who weren't members of those organizations. So that when the Insurance Act came in the early 20th century in the UK, of the 12 million people who were covered by it, 8 million of those people had already were covered by the associations to which they belonged. So we had a phenomenon of crowding out. So what happens in this kind of conversation is that people say, if we don't have a safety net that's provided by social welfare, then it's going to be terrible. The people at the bottom are all going to die and starve and so on. And I'm going, well, those aren't the only options, right? And of course, they have no knowledge of these friendly associations. It's gone down the memory hole. Nobody knows it's there. This comes as a surprise. Every time I give this paper or talk about it, people go, really? I never knew about this. And I go, why am I not surprised? Why wouldn't they tell you about this? So those aren't the alternatives. Could I finish by saying, by the way, that very often when libertarians present themselves as being against coercion, and that's true, right? But more positively, we are pro-liberty. And the trouble with that is when people say, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, people should be free, and the world is your oyster, to do all sorts of things, provide education for your own children, to come together in groups to provide education away from the state with your own curriculum, to provide cooperative means of funding and placing your money together, and anything, all of these things. In other words, it's practically unlimited. And that's why it's so difficult. Okay, that's why, in fact, the negative expression is easier to say, but of course it gives the impression we're just a lot of grumpy people who are just against things, but we're actually for liberty. We're saying, please, there's a big world out there. Go and do things which enhance your life, the life of your family members, the lives of your community, the lives of your nation, the lives of strangers. Please go and do it. What's stopping you? I'll tell you what's stopping you. The state, by and large, is stopping you. So go do it.
Yes, and on your example of let the poor starve, paradoxically, people are more likely to say that when you have a welfare state because they feel it's nothing to do with them.
Mm.
You know, they feel like, okay, their neighbor's in trouble. Here's a phone number. They can call the welfare office. It's not somebody else's problem, not mine. And people contribute. I mean, there have been studies about this, that people contribute less to charity because they're paying taxes. They pay their taxes and they think, I've done my bit.
We can find this in Dickens in A Christmas Carol, when what's Ebenezer Scrooge is being solicited for a charity, I think in the opening pages, and he says, "Have they not workhouses?
Yes.
Have they not workhouses?" Okay. In other words, I'm having money taken from me to support the workhouses, and you expect me to give more?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's quite extraordinary. But it's not only a question, because very often people will say, well, if we don't have a safety net of social welfare, people are going to have to rely on charity, and look how mean people are and so on. Well, the thing is, of course, in a libertarian world, there would be very many fewer poor people for a start, because everybody would be able to do something for the most part, apart from a tiny amount. People would have much more money to dispose of. Some would build an extra swimming pool, and some people would actually take care of their community and their neighbors. But more importantly, people would be able to band together to, as they did in these mutual associations, to protect one another and provide for one another, and not only to do it as the recipient of some state agency. The state, by the way, is a cruel mistress and so on. They don't really care. I mean, it's, you're lucky if you can get a doctor or a nurse or somebody who isn't so busy that they can actually give you some personal attention. But a situation where people are looking after themselves, regulating their own funds, acquiring experience in administering and this, taking responsibility for themselves and so on. So yes, it's the positive picture that a libertarian would draw. It has to be seen as not simply anti what we've got now, but a whole positive, and I think enriching, and I think inspiring picture if you give it your attention properly. And so it's not just freedom to starve, okay, but it's freedom to be yourself, look after your family, look after your community, develop yourself, develop your talents, use your money wisely for yourself. Be mean if you want to, you can do that. Nobody's stopping you, right? But probably not. When you consider, by the way, the extent to which people will give to charity, even when almost half of their income is being taken from them by the state already, is actually quite striking. I can remember there was some emergency around the world. There's always some emergency, but this one was one of the more spectacular ones. And the collection in the Catholic churches in the Diocese of Dublin raised something like 8 million euros on a given Sunday. That's money given by people which they could have put to other uses, but which, appealing to their better nature, they were prepared to give to people who were in need. So charity is alive and kicking, but more importantly, the associations, the mutual associations that were crowded out by the welfare state, if they weren't being crowded out by the welfare state, would revive. People would actually learn to take care of themselves and others again.
Yes, and in addition to charity, there's also so much more opportunity for self-reliance. You can go and, I mean, why starve? Go and offer to do odd jobs and earn a wage. You can't do that now when there's minimum wage regulation. It's ridiculous. And you could set up a little business doing anything, set up a barber shop. You can't do that now because there's licensing requirements. You can't even do childcare. You can't offer to look after your neighbor's children for money because that's also licensed. Being a hairdresser, that's licensed. Being a carer, everything's licensed. So all these things that the state is supposedly doing are causing people to starve because it makes it so much harder to earn your own living.
Yes.
There was a case not long ago of a young girl who set up a lemonade stand. The city authorities came and shut her down, said, "Where's your license?"
It sounds extraordinary. It's funny, but it's not funny. Can you imagine these burly cops coming along to arrest this girl? Seriously.
Exactly.
What a criminal, to put an end to her burgeoning criminal career.
Exactly. Now, in what society are people more more likely to starve, one where people can, earn their own living, or one where they have to wait until the state gives them permission, even to set up a lemonade stand.
I also made the point, by the way, in that paper and elsewhere, that one of the things that a welfare state does is to effectively destroy self-respect.
Yeah.
And again, this may sound hard-hearted, but what it does, in effect, to many of the people in a given jurisdiction is to say to them, you are useless.
Yeah.
You can do nothing of value. You can do nothing that anybody wants you to do. Here is some money. Go and live on the reservation somewhere far away from where I live. Okay. And please don't bother me, except during election times when I expect you to vote for me. But other than that, and so on. And it, when all of this started originally, people like accepting even money they were quote unquote entitled to under welfare, it was seen as something not good. And people's self-respect was violated by this, and they want to get back to work and self-reliance again. And now when you reach a stage where we have second and third generation families living on welfare, that is to say, money that's been extracted forcibly by other productive members of the community, whose parents have never worked, whose grandparents have never worked, who themselves cannot see any value in working because of the poverty trap. In other words, if they were to work, the difference between what they would get and what they get on welfare is so small as to make it irrational in order to do it. But who have no idea that there is a respect to be gained from engaging in employment and earning your own money. And when you get to that stage, you have now reached a second level of damage to the self-respect that any human being should have. Nobody should be told institutionally that they are completely worthless, that nobody wants anything that can do. There's nothing they can do that anybody will value. And again, this is a positive version, a positive aspect of libertarianism, because we value people. We value freedom because it gives people the opportunity to do things for themselves, to develop their abilities and skills, and to market them, and to get the reward of their labors, which is not only is the money good, by the way, I think money is great, not only is the money good, but the satisfaction of doing something that somebody else values, it is very, very rewarding to most human beings. And if you make that impossible for a large segment of the community, you haven't done them any favors.
So one thing that's coming across in this conversation, and I think your work more broadly, and maybe it's a silver lining in some ways of this attack on free speech in contemporary society and so on, is that we're having to drill down to first principles as societies. And we see this renaissance with figures like Jordan Peterson. Tom Holland in his book Dominion talks about the Christian Revolution and its impact on how we view our different structures and everything. And it seems in some ways, I don't know, I don't want to overstate it, but at certain levels of society, there's this kind of death of new atheism that people are talking about, and a rise even in cultural Christianity, with libertarianism, for example, being a very suitable fit, the emphasis on non-violence and so on that we take for granted that we can attribute to Christ. And I'm kind of curious what you both think of that, this rise of cultural Christianity with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and those figures in the news, even Richard Dawkins in his own kind of not as convincing as Ayaan's way. Those who are moving from new atheism, agnosticism, so on, to become more Christian friendly and so on. And maybe what role might this societal moment play alongside, say, more personal conversions, and how do we engage folks like this maybe to be more fruitful for Christ and or for libertarianism? Would you like to speak to that one, Gerard?
Yeah, I'm not wildly impressed by the whole notion of cultural Christianity, because in the Irish experience, that's what we had here up to the 1960s in large part. And it's what counts, if you like, for the incredible collapse of the church in Ireland when people discovered it was no longer culturally inappropriate to be non-Christian. They stopped doing it. And the problem is I don't know what your mother used to say to you, Marcus, when you were young, but my mother used to say, you cannot have the icing until you eat the cake. In case it's with cakes, they had the icing. So you made sure you ate the cake first and then the icing. So the icing on the cake, as it were, are the cultural aspects of Christianity, churches and hymns and all the things that Dawkins was rabbiting on about recently in a YouTube video. And I was saying, well, those are all very nice, but that's the icing on the cake. And that icing without the cake has nothing to rest on. In other words, without real Christianity, without real Christians, for example, Christian culture is something that's on life support, and it cannot last. And your attachment to it is largely sentimental. Now, I can understand why this is getting something of a bit of a revival, because if you'll pardon me for a moment, I want to develop very briefly a notion of kind of cultural ecology. And in the way that, for example, in any ecological situation where you have life forms and plants in a situation of balance, if you introduce a hostile or an invasive species, it upsets the whole thing, right? So what's happening is we are under attack in all sorts of ways, not least from Islam, by the way. And I don't care about the religious side of Islam, which I think is ridiculous, but leave that to one side. I'm worried about the fact that it is a compact system of thought which embodies not only religion but politics and is committed in its scriptures to world domination. Right? It's in the book. I've read it 4 times. It's there. Okay, so that's from the cultural point of view of Europe and the West generally. Islam is an invasive species, and if the intrinsic or native culture is weak and isn't able to resist it, then it will simply collapse. And I can see, so you can see, this is why I think Dawkins has his own particular agenda, because he sees Christian culture as a sort of bulwark against this. He was very coded in his language, by the way, in the YouTube video, but that's clearly what he was talking about. And frankly, I don't have much sympathy with that. If you want the benefits of Christianity, you know what one of the best things to do is be Christian. Okay. But only be Christian, by the way, if you believe it. Please don't pretend. Okay. And Christian culture without Christianity has no future. I'm sorry to be so dogmatic, but that's my natural mode.
Would you like to speak to that, Wanjiru?
Yeah, this is an interesting one for me because I think, there's been the threat to the church that's come from within.
Yes.
Not from people like Dawkins, but from the fact that people within the church have decided to promote DEI, and they've decided to promote, I don't even know what this new ideology, there's so many different elements of it, but now you have people within the church saying, if the Bible said that, then the Bible is wrong. Taking out the stained glass windows so they can put in new windows about refugees and migrants, and now saying Jesus was an undocumented migrant, Jesus was a transgender, and God is a man and a woman. To me, that's the greatest threat. So now, so this idea of cultural Christianity, the way I see it, so I'll just give an example. You have the parish church in villages where nobody goes. It's always empty. There's only 2 people there on a Sunday morning. But at Easter and Christmas, it's full. Everybody brings all their family, and there they are. And they only ever go twice a year. And now they're angry at the thought that the church is being closed down, the building. They never go there, but they want it standing for Easter and Christmas. They don't want it gone, because then they will feel the loss if there's nowhere for them to go at Easter and there's nowhere for them to go at Christmas. And to them, the greatest threat is coming from the church within, who's decided, let's repurpose the buildings. Let's sell it because we can use the money for, I don't know what they're using the money for. So
reparations.
Yeah. And just to give another example, there was this village church somewhere in, I don't remember where it was, where the new vicar decided to sell all the pews, the Victorian pews in the church, she said they're against equality because fat people can't fit in between the pews. So she had them all cleaned out and auctioned off. And then all the villagers who never ever go to church, by the way, when they heard that the Victorian pews were being sold, got angry and turned out to defend their pews. So this idea of, they're cultural Christians in the sense that to them it's not even about the faith or God, but it's about their tradition. And it's about the village church that stood there for hundreds of years. Because remember, some of these communities are communities that have lived there for generations, and that church has always been there. And so they want to defend it for that reason. And so when I think about cultural Christianity in that way, I think the greatest threat that we should be concerned about is the threat that comes from within. I like to say the church is woke captured. That's a problem. Bigger, I think, than the problem that's coming from the atheists.
Yep. Oh, indeed, I agree.
I think
It's a bit like those people who are all for the corner shop and its availability and so on. And when they hear it's closing because nobody's patronizing it, they get very upset. And I go, well, if you want the corner shop to function, you really have to turn up and buy things there. Otherwise, it goes out of business. And the same thing happens with churches. They go out of business. Yeah, you can't run a church on Christmas and Easter.
No, exactly.
So
Yeah.
I think you point to this idea, this kind of parasitical woke religion that seems to have perverted Christianity in some ways. And Ivan Illich talks about the corruption of the best things being the worst in a way that I found most helpful.
Yep.
He talks about how like the early Christians would have created the hospitals and so on, and yet now with Canada and places like that, we're seeing they're going there to be euthanized, and this perversion is taking place in schools and all these different areas. I wonder how we might combat that then from within the church and say institutionalize that in a way that doesn't become perverse.
First of all, I mean, the things that should be taught in school are reading and writing, history and geography, so that people have maps. Okay, you can teach the religion. By the way, schools, Catholic schools, for example, in Ireland, are a total disaster, and they're a total disaster because people think their children are being taught the essentials of the faith in the school. And of course, they're not, by and large. Okay, there may be certain notable exceptions. And this is the problem. So that is the church's responsibility. And if the church runs schools, then it should be church run schools and not the church providing free managerial services for state schools, which is what the situation is right now. So we really, you should, I mean, you don't teach things like equality directly, okay? You don't even teach morality directly, by and large. The way it was done and has been done historically for many, many thousands of years is through stories of heroes and heroines and people who stand up, whether in a religious context, it would be martyrs for the faith, or secular variations of the same thing, where people demonstrate bravery and justice and honesty and truth and so on. And that's how children learn these things, not by getting a lecture on it. Okay, that's not how it works. It was said that Aristotle said you cannot become ethical by taking the 50 drachma course in ethics. Right? It doesn't work like that. And if you come to a course in ethics and you ask a question such as, why shouldn't I kill my father? And you mean that as a genuine question and not some kind of smart alecky type thing, then Aristotle would say to you, you don't need a 50 drachma course in ethics. You need to go back and be re-brought up properly.
Yeah.
Because ethics is a reflection on, as it were, principles that we have already appropriated, but may not have learned to articulate. It's not a matter of learning something new from the beginning ab initio. If that situation, that's what's happening now in our world, by and large, is that many children go to school and are supposed to be educated, but in fact, they haven't learned anything. And they haven't appropriated the values that are essential to a community. And therefore, they have nothing upon which to reflect. They need to go back and be brought up properly again. That's the problem. And schools can only do so much, right? Schools can do a lot of harm, but they're limited in the amount of good that they can do. But it's parents. And that's why the destruction of the nuclear family and the father and mother and marriage and all of these things is so devastating, because it means that you have effectively feral children who are either, I mean, literally feral in the sense that they're running wild around the streets, or socially and morally feral in that they have no grounding, they have nothing upon which to stand, and therefore have no defense against the depredations of the state.
I would agree absolutely, and I think that's so important. This idea that you don't lecture children about equality or anything else. I went to church schools my whole life, I guess. And I was just reflecting the other day because people were saying, well, how will we teach people that slavery is wrong? And I was thinking, I've never, ever been told by a teacher slavery is wrong, or murder is wrong. You learn the 10 Commandments and you get a sense of right and wrong. And then when you see anything going on around you, that is what lets you know what's right and what's wrong. And that's the way that people grow up. This is one of the reasons I'm so happy that the homeschooling movement is growing, because children will be at home and they'll be learning in the way that we always learned. Equality is a particularly bad thing to teach children at school, because even if you don't use the words equality of outcome, so many people are saying, oh, the problem is if you call it equality of outcome, but if you call it equality of opportunity, that's great. Well, even if you don't use the words outcome, if you say to young children, it's very important for everybody to be equal, that's what they're hearing. They're hearing we must all be the same, we must all be doing the same things, and you're basically just teaching them socialism. Everybody has to have, or communism, everybody has to have the same amount of stuff, even though you don't use those words. So I think that if anything, if we're going to reform schools, we should reform them in the direction of basically the point Gerard started out making. Teach children how to read, how to write, how to do basic maths, and how to read maps. And that's it.
Yep.
No,
And it doesn't take 8 years to do that, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
No.
exactly.
No, that's excellent, folks. Thank you so much. And in preparing for this conversation, I actually had written in my notes that one of the things that I liked about both of your works was that you hit on the different, say, I thought about it in the context of Plato's tripartite soul, that you both hit on that kind of appetitive level of human beings, their intellectual level and the spirited sort of level. And I think that's something I'm learning more all the time with Jordan Peterson and those folks. We need to tell a better story. And my wife and I actually even are now doing a course with Storytellers of Ireland, and I'm trying to incorporate some of these philosophical ideas and everything I've learnt over the course of my life into the stories in a subtle way that's not too kind of didactic or anything, but it's fits organically with the tradition and so on. And I think it's really resonating with people a lot more than some of the stuff that I did in the past. I would quote long pieces, philosophical pieces at them and so on, and it wasn't hitting them at those different
That's true.
levels. So
C.S. Lewis, if I remember rightly, I think it's in The Abolition of Man, has a chapter called Men Without Chests.
Mhm.
All right. And that's what he means. He's talking about that middle level that Plato talks about. Okay. Which is between the basic instincts that we have and desires and appetites, which are fine, they're human, and so on, and the purely intellectual. But it's that sort of filling in the middle, okay, that makes human beings to be truly human, not purely intellectual detached beings and not pure animals and so on, but rational beings, embodied beings, and so on. And that notion of having a chest means having that kind of character, or developing that character as part of what it is to be human, so that you can then, as it were, live from the inside out and not simply react to environmental factors that are impinging upon you. And if you don't have a chest, a la C.S. Lewis, this is what you're going to have. You're going to have a whole generation of people who are not capable of resisting anything that's imposed upon them.
Amen. Thank you so much,
Amen.
folks. We've been going for approx an hour now, so We discussed beforehand that that may be a good time to stop, but I've most appreciated both of your perspectives, and perhaps we can do something like this again in the future if you're interested in that, or else again this can serve as a springboard to dive into your work. So I want to say thank you so much, but just give you both an opportunity to maybe tell my viewers or listeners where they can find out more about you and your work, and if there's anything that you're working on at present.
The answer is no. Since I published Hidden Agenda, I've had about 4 or 5 projects on the go, all of them incredibly interesting until I actually have to do some real work on them, and then the other ones become very interesting. So I haven't settled down to a new project, unfortunately, at the moment, and I may never do it again. I've reached an age where I don't know. I mean, I need to be irritated in order to write. Okay. I need to sort of get angry in order to do it and be upset. And I'm finding a lot of pleasure in Twitterizing or Twittering or Xing or whatever we call it these days. And it's curious because a friend said to me, you know, he said, you're having more influence since you've been on Twitter than you ever did with all your books. And I thought, well, that says something about the spirit of the age, but there we are. Okay. So the short answer is no. If people want to sort of find out what I'm thinking on a daily basis, they can check in to X. But obviously the same is for Wanjiru, who's even more prolific on the posting front than I am. And as I said at the start, much more direct.
Gerard, your tweets are great. You know, I learned so much from reading your tweets, especially your longer form ones, where you explain quite a lot and give the context, and even sometimes have extracts from your publications. That's great. So I would definitely recommend to anybody to follow Gerard. And I think I put most of what I'm working on Twitter as well. If you go on the oh, sorry, X, we're supposed to call it X. I put most of what I'm working on X
We
as
all
well.
call it Twitter.
If you go to the highlights, you can see there the articles, longer articles that I've written for the Mises Institute, just explaining some of the ideas in greater length. But then I have, of course, the short, hard-hitting tweets that Gerard is
I love
describing.
them. I love them. They make my day.
Thank you so much, folks. I most appreciated chatting with you both. And yeah, I'll see you in a few days, Jared, and God willing, we'll get to
See you,
meet you in
Marcus.
person
Yes,
someday,
please
Wanjiru.
do. Wanjiru, it's been a pleasure to meet you virtually. I hope we meet in the flesh, as it were, one of these days.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been great talking with you both.
Very good.
God bless you guys.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you wanna go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm on my way. I'm going there. I'm going there. No.